This video was recorded at the Spring Institute, March 2021. Our guest speaker in this video is Glen Kreiner, Professor of Business at the University of Utah.
So hello everyone from across the world. It's very exciting to be a part of this today. I was very glad to be invited, and so thank you so much for putting this all together and bringing this really cool community together this week. It's such a worthy endeavor, and I'm really happy to be a part of it today. So my name is Glen Kreiner. I am at the Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah. And this is my first year there. I spent several years at Penn State and a few years at the University of Cincinnati before that. I am primarily an identity scholar. So most of the work that I do focuses on the concept of identity, or a sense of who we are in the workplace and how the workplace shapes how we think about ourselves as individuals and as groups and as the whole organization. A lot of the work that I have done connects identity to other things. So sometimes those things are occupational groups. Sometimes those things are other concepts in the literature. So let me give you a couple of examples of that, because one of the things that I wanted to accomplish in my time with you today is to encourage you to think about ways that you can weave in identity to the research that you're already doing in the disability space. So I want to give you some examples of how I have woven identity into other topic areas. So we've done research on how identity shows up in terms of work-family dynamics, for example. So how people segment or integrate different parts of their work and non-work lives, or how people transition from the many different roles that they play during the day and how that sense of who they are affects that role transition process. We've also connected identity to topics like ethics. So we are working on a paper right now, for example, that looks at how certain roles in organizations have an ethical component baked into them. And what does that mean for the identity of the person in that role as they're trying to help others be ethical and create an ethical organization. We've also looked at identity and stigma. So how dirty work jobs, stigmatized organizations provide a context for how people make sense of who they are vis-a-vis the workplace. We've also looked at identity and mindfulness, of how identity can help us understand, or excuse me, how mindfulness can help us understand who we are. And then the past few years, I've been integrating identity into disability research. And that's one of the latest ways that we've been applying identity into another area of research. And so we have a few projects on that. So I would encourage you to think about ways that you can bring this idea of identity into what you do. So with that, I want to give you a couple of different ways that I think might be useful for you to think about how to do that. And I'll spend most of my time at the individual level of identity. In other words, how each person thinks about him or herself. But just know that the concept of identity can also apply at a more aggregated level. So it's an occupational identity, group identity, team identity, organizational identity. So realize the things I'm talking about can be applied not just to individuals. So Marilyn Brewer and her colleagues have a useful distinction about different parts of us and our individual identity that I think is really useful for us to think about, especially if you're doing research in the disability space. So there's 3 different parts, and I'll tell you a little bit about each of these parts. And as I go through it, you can imagine for yourself how these 3 components, how you would answer these 3 components for yourself, but also think about the people that you research and how they might answer for themselves these 3 different components. So the first component is what's called personal identity. This is the part of ourselves that are based on personal characteristics, our own unique life history, the stories that have occurred to us that we share about other people, many of the labels that we put upon ourselves in terms of personality or characteristics would fall under this. So you could see yourself as capable or incapable. You could see yourself as resilient, not resilient. You could see yourself as outgoing or shy. All those characteristics would follow under it. We're doing a study right now on workers on the autism spectrum. And one of the things that we write about in one of those papers are the personal characteristics that many of our informants shared with us. So they'll say, I'm a rule follower, for example, right? So that's personal identity. Relational identity is the part of ourselves of how we define ourselves based on the relationships that we have with other people and the roles that we play in an organization. So you might think of particular relationships, whether that's with a supervisor or with a spouse or with children or teammates, and how those relationships might define us. So when people make statements like, I don't get along well with others, or I'm dependent on others, or I don't need others, or I would be nothing without her, or our friendship means the world to me. All of those things are tapping into a relational identity because they're defining themselves somehow based on roles and relationships. And then the third part of individual identity is what's called collective identity or social identity. And this is how we define ourselves based on the groups or collectives that we belong to. And it could be a huge social group like gender or nationality or religion, but it might be a small social group like a team that someone is on in the workplace, or the organization that they work for, or a club that they're a member of. So when people say I'm in the disability community, or I'm autistic, or I'm a person on the autism spectrum, those are claims about who we are based on group membership. So you can see with the three different parts that if you're studying persons with disabilities, you could see how the way that they combine how they refer to themselves and how they think of themselves is going to be some sort of aggregation of these three different components. And so I think it's really fun to explore and think about ways that we can integrate this identity research into what we're doing in other areas. So another thing I want to mention in terms of these three different components, there's the idea of what's called identity orientation. And that's basically how much of each of these three parts is represented in us. So do you mostly define on personal attributes? Do you mostly define on relational attributes? Do you mostly define based on collective attributes? So each person has sort of a different proportion of each of these three. And that could be something very interesting to study as well, along with whatever you're studying, because it helps inform how the person sees themselves differently, okay? So people vary on their need for inclusion versus distinctiveness. So as they're trying to figure out, well, how much uniqueness should I have in defining myself versus how much I belong? And that's something very interesting that we have seen in the disability community, is how much of a claim toward the particular disability someone has do they have for that group versus pointing out the distinctions or differences they have from that group. So as people try to define themselves and present themselves to others, they're balancing that uniqueness with inclusion with the group. So to wrap up the comments, what I would hope that you could consider is to think about how to connect identity with the topic areas that you're already interested in, as well as connecting identity and disability, because I think it provides a really powerful theoretical lens that is not just in management, which is my area, but identity is a key component in social psychology and psychology, and even in anthropology. Lots of different disciplines and areas use it. So I think it can provide a very powerful space for you to connect with what you're already doing. So thank you very much, and happy to take your question.
Thanks very much for watching. You can like and subscribe to our channel below. We're currently working on a British Academy funded project looking at the lived experience of disabled people during the pandemic. And you can find out what we're up to at tendproject.com, or on Twitter @TEND Project. Thank you.